The Johnson family had always been admired in their neighborhood, a family that seemed to embody stability and happiness. Their home, a modest two-story house with white shutters and a well-kept lawn, stood as a symbol of what many believed was the American dream. Every morning, neighbors could see Claire ushering the children to the school bus, her smile bright even in the early hours. Mark, with his crisp firefighter's uniform, would wave before heading off to his shift. People often spoke about how fortunate the couple was to have built such a life, balancing meaningful careers with a picture-perfect family. From birthday barbecues in the backyard to volunteering at local events, the Johnsons were deeply woven into the fabric of the community. Yet beneath the appearance of normalcy, cracks had already begun to spread through the foundation of their seemingly perfect lives. Mark carried a secret that few could have suspected. As a firefighter, he was seen as strong and dependable, someone who faced danger with courage. But behind closed doors, he was drowning in financial problems. The family's lifestyle had stretched beyond their means, and with 2 children growing up quickly, the expenses kept piling up. Mark had turned to multiple loans and credit cards, creating a web of debt he could not untangle. He hid the mounting bills in a locked drawer, always assuring himself he would find a way out. His pride, and his fear of disappointing Claire, kept him silent. Each month the weight on his shoulders grew heavier, but outwardly, he carried the same smile and steady composure that everyone admired. Claire, on the other hand, bore a different kind of burden. While she adored her role as a teacher and loved her students, she had begun to sense something unsettling in her daily life. For weeks she had felt watched, as though someone lingered just out of sight. At first, she brushed it off as nerves or imagination, but the feeling grew stronger each night, and soon she could no longer ignore it. She started keeping a diary, writing down every strange incident. The diary became her private confessional, filled with accounts of shadows moving near the yard, of a car idling down the street too long, and of noises outside the window late at night. Claire never shared these worries with Mark, believing he already had enough on his mind. Instead, she tucked the journal into her bedside table, hoping that by recording her fears she might make sense of them. Together, Mark and Claire presented themselves as an unbreakable team, but the truth was that they were living separate battles. The children, too young to understand, continued their carefree routines, playing with friends in the neighborhood, and bringing home school projects that filled the refrigerator door. To anyone observing, nothing seemed out of place. The Johnsons still hosted family dinners, still attended church on Sundays, and still waved warmly to their neighbors. But inside their home, silence grew more common, with Claire preoccupied by unease and Mark consumed by worry over finances. What made their situation even more haunting was how expertly they masked it. Friends and family never noticed a change. Teachers at the children's school described them as happy and thriving, and Mark's colleagues saw no cracks in his cheerful demeanor. The Johnsons were skilled at keeping up appearances, building a wall so strong that no one suspected the storm gathering just beyond it. Yet, as the days of September unfolded, the forces they had kept hidden were beginning to converge. Mark's secrets about money, Claire's growing paranoia, and the unspoken tension in their home were aligning towards something neither of them could predict. To the outside world, they were still the perfect family, but perfection is fragile, and the Johnsons' carefully crafted image was about to break in the most unthinkable way. The night of September 18th began like any other in the quiet neighborhood, but within the Johnson home, an unsettling silence had settled in. Usually, the house glowed with the warmth of family life, the sound of children's laughter echoing from upstairs, and the faint smell of Claire's cooking drifting through the halls. That evening, however, there was none of that. The porch light, which almost always burned late into the night as a small beacon of safety, was dark. A few neighbors noticed, but no one thought much of it at the time. After all, even the most predictable families sometimes broke routine. Still, the house seemed strangely lifeless, as though something heavy hung in the air. something unseen but deeply felt. By morning, that eerie stillness had transformed into concern. Claire, who was known for her punctuality and reliability, never arrived at the school where she taught. Her colleagues, accustomed to her cheerful greetings and well-prepared lessons, were surprised by her unexplained absence. At first, they assumed it was an illness or family emergency, but when no call or message came through, worry began to spread. Meanwhile, the Johnson children did not show up at the bus stop. The driver waited a few extra moments, scanning the street for their familiar faces, but they never appeared. For a family as dependable as the Johnsons, the missed commitments were more than unusual. They were alarming. Mark's colleagues at the fire station noticed his absence too. He was not scheduled for a long shift, and his truck had not been seen in the driveway since the night before. At first, his co-workers thought he might be dealing with a personal issue, but as hours passed, the unanswered calls and messages painted a darker picture. By late afternoon, the lack of contact from any member of the Johnson family became impossible to ignore. Neighbors began discussing it amongst themselves, comparing what they had noticed. One remembered seeing Mark's truck gone late at night, something that rarely happened. Another recalled how quiet the house seemed, the windows drawn shut, and no sign of movement inside. Eventually, the growing unease led to a wellness check. When police officers arrived, they approached the Johnson home with caution. From the outside, everything looked ordinary. The mailbox stuffed with no more than a day's worth of letters, the garden neatly trimmed, the dog barking faintly from within. Yet, as soon as the officers stepped inside, an atmosphere of unease swept over them. The house was immaculate, almost unnaturally so, as if someone had gone out of their way to erase any trace of life. Breakfast plates were neatly set on the dining table, food untouched, cups still half filled with juice. The children's school bags were left by the door, ready for the day that never came. Upstairs the beds were made, sheets smooth and undisturbed, giving no indication that anyone had slept in them. The officers moved carefully from room to room, but the deeper they searched, the more chilling the scene became. The family dog, normally playful and free to roam, was discovered shut inside the laundry room, whimpering anxiously as if it had been locked away intentionally. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no signs of forced entry. It was as though the Johnson family had simply vanished in the middle of their lives, leaving behind a house frozen in time. What unsettled the officers most was the feeling that someone had been there only moments before, that the silence of the house was not the emptiness of neglect, but something more sinister. As the day faded into evening, the search widened. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, asking residents if they had noticed anything unusual. Some mentioned the gray sedan that had been parked near the Johnson home at odd hours, though no one had thought it important until now. Others admitted that they had sensed something strange about the family in recent weeks but dismissed it as nothing more than stress. Each piece of information added to the mystery, but none provided answers. The Johnsons were nowhere to be found, and the trail seemed to vanish with them. What should have been just another day in a quiet town had transformed into the beginning of a nightmare. The family's absence was no longer just unusual, it was terrifying. Within 24 hours, the Johnsons went from being the model family of the neighborhood to the center of a baffling mystery. And as investigators looked around the eerily pristine house, they couldn't shake the feeling that the silence inside those walls was only the beginning of something far more disturbing. Investigators wasted no time diving into the Johnsons' lives, determined to uncover what could explain their sudden disappearance. At first, they focused on the most logical path following the money. Mark's role as a firefighter had earned him a reputation for bravery and dedication, but his financial records told a different story. Credit card accounts hidden under his name revealed purchases that far exceeded his income. Multiple overdue loans suggested a man desperately trying to maintain appearances while spiraling into debt. Investigators began to question whether Mark had orchestrated the family's disappearance to escape the crushing weight of his financial struggles. But almost as quickly as this theory surfaced, new evidence pointed in a very different direction. Claire's diary, discovered in her bedside table, changed the course of the investigation. Her entries painted a picture of growing fear and paranoia in the weeks leading up to that September night. She described spotting a grey sedan parked outside their home on more than one occasion, always late at night, always lingering too long. She wrote about hearing footsteps near the windows, and about the unsettling feeling that someone was following her during her morning walks. Her words were not the ramblings of an overactive imagination. They reflected a woman who knew something was wrong, but could not convince anyone else of it. Investigators studied every entry, treating her fears not as speculation, but as evidence of a possible stalker. The breakthrough came from traffic camera footage collected from intersections around the Johnson neighborhood. Hours of recordings showed patterns that aligned with Claire's diary entries. The same grey sedan appeared night after night, sometimes circling the block, sometimes parked near the Johnsons' home for long stretches of time. The vehicle's license plate was obscured or tampered with, making it difficult to trace, but the consistent presence was undeniable. Whoever owned that car had been watching the Johnsons carefully, waiting for a moment to act. As detectives widened their search, another chilling clue emerged. Mark's truck was discovered abandoned in a desolate parking lot 20 miles from the family home. The location itself raised questions. It was isolated, rarely used, and far from any of Mark's usual routes. Inside the truck, investigators found something that deepened the mystery even further. On the passenger seat lay a family photograph that had been deliberately burned, the faces of the children scorched out, while the rest of the image remained intact. It was a grotesque and symbolic act, one that suggested personal hatred or obsession. The find unsettled even the most seasoned officers, leaving them to wonder whether this was a message from Mark himself, or from someone targeting the family. The investigation became a battle between competing theories. One possibility was that Mark had snapped under financial and personal pressure, staging everything to cover his tracks, but that theory weakened when analysts examined his phone records and discovered calls made to Claire's number in the days before the disappearance, calls traced to an unfamiliar prepaid phone. These calls were brief and untraceable, but they pointed to a third party inserting themselves into the Johnsons' lives. Friends and colleagues of Claire offered more insights. Several admitted that she had mentioned her unease in passing, but they dismissed it at the time, assuming she was just stressed. No one imagined that her concerns were rooted in something real. That collective dismissal only made the truth more disturbing. The signs had been there all along, but no one recognized them until it was too late. With each revelation, the case grew darker. The burned photograph suggested rage, the grey sedan suggested surveillance, the diary suggested fear, and the abandoned truck suggested planning. Investigators realized they were not dealing with a random act, but with someone who had watched, waited, and prepared for this moment. Every lead pulled them deeper into a web of obsession and malice, leaving one haunting question hanging over the case. Had the Johnsons been taken by someone they knew, or by a stranger who had carefully chosen them as victims? The case took a chilling turn several weeks after the disappearance, when hikers wandering through a dense patch of woodland came across something that stopped them in their tracks. A shallow mound of disturbed earth caught their attention, the soil loosely covered with branches and leaves. As though someone had tried to conceal it in haste, the hikers alerted authorities, and when investigators arrived, the grim truth was revealed. Buried beneath the ground were the bodies of Claire and the two children. The discovery was devastating not only for the community, but also for the officers themselves, many of whom had spent sleepless nights searching and hoping for a different outcome. The scene was carefully arranged, suggesting planning and a disturbing level of control. What had begun as a disappearance was now officially a murder case, one that would haunt the town forever. The medical examiner's findings only deepened the horror. Claire had been killed quickly, likely to silence her first, while the children had been suffocated, their lives taken with a cruelty too difficult for investigators to even speak of. The way the bodies were buried told its own story. They had been placed with a strange, deliberate care, as though the killer wanted to hide them, but could not resist marking his crime in a twisted, ritualistic fashion. The realization that someone had chosen not only to end their lives, but also to arrange the aftermath, so precisely disturbed even the most hardened detectives. The immediate question was the absence of Mark. His body was not there. For some, this pointed directly to him as the murderer who had disposed of his family and fled. For others, it raised the possibility that he too was a victim, taken by whoever had orchestrated this nightmare. The burned photograph found earlier in his truck now became a crucial clue. Investigators wrestled with the symbolism. Why were the children's faces burned out, but not Claire's or Mark's? Was the killer targeting Mark by destroying what he loved most? Or was it Mark himself, expressing rage and despair through a symbolic act before vanishing? Attention soon shifted to Claire's diary once again, and it provided the breakthrough the case desperately needed. In the weeks before her death, she had exchanged secret messages with someone from her past, an old acquaintance named Daniel. He had a history of violence and criminal activity, including harassment charges from previous relationships. His name had appeared in no official reports until investigators began piecing together phone records that linked his number to the anonymous calls Claire had received. Suddenly, a clearer picture began to form. Daniel was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone who knew Claire, someone who had inserted himself back into her life in ways that seemed harmless at first but quickly became dangerous. When investigators tracked him down, they found him hiding in an abandoned farmhouse, not far from where the bodies were discovered. His appearance was disheveled, his clothing torn, and his demeanor disturbed. The farmhouse itself was a chilling reflection of his state of mind. Broken furniture, scrawled writings on the walls, and a sense of decay that clung to every surface. What police found inside was worse than they expected. In one corner, they uncovered items belonging to the Johnson family, clothing, toys, and even school projects from the children. These objects confirmed what everyone feared. Daniel had been stalking them, collecting pieces of their lives as though they were trophies. Under interrogation, Daniel eventually confessed to killing Claire and the children. His reasoning was incoherent, filled with fragmented thoughts and distorted emotions. He spoke of wanting to keep them forever, and of punishing Mark for reasons that made little sense to anyone but himself. Yet one detail in his confession sent a wave of shock through the room. He claimed Mark was still alive. According to Daniel, he had spared him, not out of mercy, but because he wanted Mark to suffer. He claimed to have taken him somewhere, a place, dark and safe, where Mark would be forced to live with the knowledge of what had happened to his family. This revelation shifted the case from tragedy to a desperate race against time. If Daniel's words were true, Mark might still be alive, hidden somewhere beyond the reach of search teams. The thought of him enduring captivity, unaware that his family had already been murdered, shook investigators to their core. The focus of the case turned immediately to finding him, combing through Daniel's vague statements for any clue that could lead to his location. Every detail mattered: the woods, the farmhouse, the objects Daniel had collected. All of it was studied for signs of where Mark might be held. The discovery of the bodies was supposed to bring closure, but instead it opened a new chapter filled with even more urgency and horror. What had been a mystery of disappearance had transformed into one of murder and captivity. The community that once celebrated the Johnsons as a perfect family was now paralyzed by grief and fear, and the entire nation began watching as investigators scrambled to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. Somewhere out there, Mark was either enduring unimaginable torment or waiting for a rescue that might already be too late. The farmhouse where Daniel was captured became the center of a frantic investigation. Every inch was searched, every item catalogued, and every scribble on the walls analyzed in hopes of discovering where Mark had been taken. The writings, scrawled in jagged letters across rotting wood, repeated strange phrases about loyalty, punishment, and betrayal. Investigators knew they were reading the fragmented mind of a disturbed man, but they also believed the madness might conceal clues. Among the debris, they found a set of old maps, water-stained and torn, with markings circling different parts of the county. One particular mark stood out, a small cross drawn near an abandoned property that had once belonged to Daniel's uncle. It was a remote, crumbling farmhouse long forgotten by most, and it became the next target in the search. Teams of officers moved quickly, fearing that time was running out. When they arrived at the property, the atmosphere was heavy with dread. The building stood half, hidden by overgrown weeds, its windows shattered, its door hanging loosely from rusted hinges. As they entered, the smell of damp earth and decay filled the air. The house above ground was empty, but when they pushed aside a rug in one corner, they uncovered a trapdoor leading to a basement. It was locked with a heavy chain, and the silence that seeped from below was unbearable. When the officers broke it open and descended into the darkness, their flashlights revealed a sight that left them shaken. There, chained to the wall, was Mark Johnson. His body was thin and battered, his clothes torn, and his eyes hollow from exhaustion and despair. He looked up at the lights with a mixture of disbelief and relief, as though he wasn't sure whether the figures standing before him were real. The officers rushed to free him, their hands trembling as they worked to unlock the restraints. When the chains fell, Mark collapsed into their arms, unable to stand on his own. Some of the officers, hardened by years of gruesome cases, broke down at the sight. It was not just the cruelty of his captivity that overwhelmed them, but the knowledge of what he would soon be told. That his wife and children were gone forever. Mark was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize him. Physically, he was weak but alive, something that felt miraculous after weeks of captivity. Emotionally, however, he carried scars that no treatment could erase. Once he regained enough strength to understand his surroundings, investigators gently revealed the fate of his family. Witnesses later recalled the moment as unbearable. Mark's cries were described as raw and unearthly, a sound that even the medical staff could not forget. The news broke him in a way that survival alone could not mend. The story spread rapidly across the nation, capturing headlines and dominating broadcasts. The Johnson family had once symbolized the ideal American household, and now they symbolized something much darker: the fragility of safety, the hidden dangers of obsession, and the devastating cost of ignoring warning signs. News outlets replayed the discovery of Mark again and again, labeling it both a tragedy and a miracle. Communities across the country held vigils, not only to honor Claire and the children, but also to show support for Mark, who had endured the unimaginable and lived to carry its weight. Daniel's trial revealed further details of his twisted motives, though none provided real comfort. He claimed to have fixated on Claire for years, convincing himself that she belonged to him, and that Mark had stolen her away. His obsession spiraled into rage, leading him to target not just Claire but the entire family. The burned photograph, the surveillance in the grey sedan, the carefully planned abduction, all were pieces of his delusional revenge. He showed little remorse, and the court had no hesitation in sentencing him to life without parole. But for many, justice did not bring peace. Mark became the silent reminder of what had been lost. He returned to the town, but nothing was the same. Neighbors who once admired the Johnsons now struggled to meet his eyes, overwhelmed by guilt and sorrow. His home, once filled with warmth, stood as a ghostly shell of memories he could not bear to relive. Despite the outpouring of national sympathy, Mark lived each day with the crushing reality that he had been forced to survive, while the people he loved most had not. The case remained etched in America's memory, not only for its brutality, but for its haunting emotional weight. It was rare for seasoned police officers to admit to tears, yet many who worked on the investigation confessed they had never been so deeply affected. The image of Mark chained in darkness, surviving only to face unbearable grief, became the lasting symbol of the tragedy. It was a story that shocked the entire nation, not just because of the crime itself, but because it revealed the depth of cruelty one human being could inflict, and the devastating resilience of another forced to endure it.